one thing that we wanted to do was to move away from the book. We like to say it's just so perfect. If we were to try to actually translate it or adapt it in a traditional sense, not only would it be a deep uphill climb, but it would probably just fail and it would just force comparisons. And so how do we let the book be the book and then try to do cinema as best as cinema can be done? And in that sense, we go immediately back to the source material, which is the Dozier School for Boys. And the film starts to build itself out visually.
Hello, and welcome back to The Director's Cut, brought to you by the Directors Guild of America. In this episode, two young African-American men navigate the trials of reform school in director RaMell Ross's period drama, Nickel Boys. Based on the novel by Colson Whitehead, the film tells the story of Elwood, who's sentenced to the brutal reformatory Nickel Academy in Jim Crow South after an innocent misstep. Upon meeting Turner, a seasoned ward of the reformatory, Elwood learns the fundamental tips for survival while striving to hold on to his humanity and forms a powerful friendship with Turner. In addition to Nickel Boys, Ross's other directorial credit includes the feature film Hale County, This Morning, This Evening. Following a screening of the film at the DGA Theater in Los Angeles, Ross spoke with director Channing Godfrey Peoples about filming Nickel Boys. Listen on for their spoiler-filled conversation.
Hi, RaMell.
Hello, Channing. Hello, everyone. Thanks for staying and coming.
Are y'all blown away? I'm going to jump right in because I'm so blown away by this film. And I want to start by saying, I want to congratulate you first on this stunning film. There's so much detail. I was struck by the texture. And there's just this, when I was watching it, I was like, wow, there's this beauty, there's this poetry, there's this fluidity that you don't often get to see. And I think what was the icing on the cake for me as a filmmaker who makes stories about Black folks in the South is the nuanced way that your work portrays Black people, especially in the South. So can you speak a little about the way you came to envision the world and your influences?
Jeez.
The heady questions.
The way I envision the world and my influences.
Yep.
Well, I think I've been, over the course of developing a photographic sensibility, becoming more and more interested in trying to address the sort of invisible authority of the photograph, the way that it perceives the world or presents the world sort of as objective. While it's always authored by someone, it erases the authorship. And, for me, the way that the history of photography and film has connected to the production of ideas of Blackness, specifically in the US, but also the way that photography and film have sort of replaced perception of communities abroad, meaning that we don't have access to every other country. And so the photographs are ways of accessing. But of course, it's a deep two-dimensional reduction of the lived world. I've moved towards making work that's deeply subjective and deeply poetic to allow images to not sort of fall into being easily read, while also exploring poetics from a sensibility that hasn't been traditionally in charge of the camera and had the power to iterate that subjectivity in a poetic way. And so I didn't quite answer your question, but that's the best I can do given the scale. If we had some time.
Oh, you'll have plenty of time in this half hour. I have plenty of questions, so I'll move through as quickly as possible. I want to kind of pivot a little bit, and I'm going to go back to your earlier work, but talk us through how you came aboard this particular story. Like, what about this book made you want to pursue this project?
Yeah, well, I think it's just generally unprecedented to be able to imagine within such a Pulitzer Prize winning book, a narrative that is so sort of complete and and easily read. Like, we know that story very well. The young Black boy who has promise, who falls victim to powers outside of his control. It's just like, that's it. For me, seeing myself as both Elwood and Turner, it's interesting to think about what their poetic reality was in a time in which there was no media that explored the poetic reality of those times. Even our reflections back on it from this point in time, traditionally, we even call like the civil rights era, which it was, but that wasn't something that was as driven as it seems to be for people on the ground because they were inside of it. Mm-hmm. They had lives that were like largely mundane and like largely banal. And how do you sort of give life then to those without foreclosing their entire reality to the narratives that we have in hindsight? It's really interesting to me. Give subjectivity to characters, historical characters, and let them live in the way in which we're living now, which is just being in the world and seeing the world. And I think it's that insider approach is just really fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was really struck in watching this film with just your visual style. Okay. And I loved, like many of us that are familiar with Hale County this evening, and I saw it translate from that documentary to this narrative. So I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about how your first film and your other artistic works have led to Nickel Boys and, what you brought over.
Yeah, so I don't know if you all have seen Hale County this evening, but it's a film that I made. Thanks, guys. Yeah, not the worst film, I would love it if you all saw it. It would make a lot more sense if you're wondering, like, boy, that seems to have come out of nowhere. It kind of did, and it originated when I made that film. It was a film that's born of rules, and one of the rules was I wanted the film to be like incredibly visually musical. And so, instead of having traditional narrative structure, there are 5 visual movements in the film. And there are scenes that happen over the course of the visual movements, but it's organized in a way in which you where the person is at the point in time is irrelevant to the feelings of them being, in the world as it happens. It's also organized in a way that I think is interested in what the image can do before it's translated into language. Mm-hmm. And I think, when someone writes a script, I think that the traditional process is to write the words down, to write the script, and then to go to imaging. But to me, that means that the images are servant to the language. And so if you, like in this film, the way that Jocelyn Barnes and I wrote the script was a completely visual script. Mm-hmm. We made the edit of the film first with images, and then we went in the other direction to language, so that the language is a servant to the image. And we know that the image is such a large, has the possible means of analysis are infinite. Mm-hmm. And so taking this deeply visual approach, one that's not necessarily narrative heavy, but one that's interested in, a photographic moment and a multiplicity of them to attempt at some sort of emotional gestalt, was what I did with Hale County and just applied here. Mm-hmm. And Colson's narrative is so known, and the power of Nickel Boys is so kind of just clear and ready-made. It lends itself to just having, you can always just fall back. It doesn't take much to understand what's going on. Mm-hmm. You can like play around with what the visual world was and then have a scene, and you already know like where they are in the process of this struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that really strikes me about your work is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about this, is just how much the environment seems to inform the work. You could feel a sense of atmosphere in the work. And so how does that inspire you or inform you when you're taking on an artistic work?
Yeah, it does. I like that question because it's, I think it's kind of taking an almost Eastern philosophical approach to the world, in that, traditionally when a person has a camera, like human beings are the center of it. But to me, human beings are just in like the larger world. And so, people are their environment, and their environment shapes the person. And this isn't necessarily about nature or nurture, but it is about giving the feeling of the viscerality of the real world as a person is in it. And yeah, cinema is like ripe for anything sensory. I mean, as we know, it's like the most fun medium to play in that sense.
Mm-hmm. You jumped ahead to one of my next questions. Colson Whitehead's book, The Nickel Boys, which you mentioned earlier, is obviously a Pulitzer Prize winner in 2020 for Best Fiction. I wanted to know, like, what is the process like when adapting this kind of story? And, how did you do that with your co-writer and producer, Jocelyn Barnes?
Yeah, I touched on it, but I think one thing that we wanted to do was to move away from the book, genuinely as a sign of respect, because it's so, we like to say it's just so perfect. If we were to try to actually translate it or adapt it in a traditional sense, not only would it be a deep uphill climb, but it would probably just fail and it would just force comparisons. And so how do we let the book be the book and then try to do cinema as best as cinema can be done? And in that sense, we go immediately back to the source material, which is the Dozier School for Boys, and which closed in 2011. And 2013, the bodies started to come up. And then you come across these archival images and you see the boys themselves, and you get a sense for where Colson got, the sort of emotional force behind the narrative. And, you realize that, those images should probably be in. And the film starts to build itself out visually. I think the primary process was just imagining, I think one working idea was, what if Elwood and Turner had their own cameras to make their own hell counties in the 60s and 70s? Obviously an impossibility. But then you're like, oh, what does the world literally look like as they walk? And then you can build out that with tent poles of the more necessary scenes from Colson's book. It's also about distilling Colson's book to the best of our ability to its its thinnest or its most essence, the essence, which is, we just came across love, which seems to be a bit of a platitude, but it carries through every character. It's how the characters are open to each other.
I love that.
It's why Elwood's open to MLK. It's, the hug that Hattie gives to Turner is a hug that one would argue Turner hadn't had in many years, opens him up to Elwood. And so once you find that, it's easy to remove other scenes, I
absolutely love that.
Yeah.
You come from a very impressive background in what I was reading.
Okay.
In art, photography, writing, academia, and documentary filmmaking. How did that all come to play when deciding on a work's artistic direction? How do you use all those things?
Yeah, how do you use all of those things? Well, I feel like the job of the director is to use by any means necessary. You're supposed to have the widest scope of the project, and I think all of those things they come out of a genuine interest in things and in the world, and so they're very much inextricable from the way in which I think. So it'd be kind of hard not to have, philosophy, or not to have, more traditional poetic prose in mind when I'm doing something, and not to have it have a photographic sensibility, because all of those things have just become so vital to the way in which I even see myself, and I've structured the world for myself. And so, but I think honestly, the breakthrough was the ability, the support that we got from our producers. And, of course, the guidance over the course of the process, but to be able to do things like have the defined ones in the film.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I had a question about that.
Yeah, is pretty unprecedented. I mean, it's obviously Sidney Poitier, and he has a legacy that, needs to be preserved, if not, elevated. And, we had a lot of trouble with the archival images, because they're archival images of children, and although they're owned in archives and they can be, you can be indemnified or whatever, they didn't sign off to being in those archives, nor to be in those images, and no one knew who made those images. And so the types of problems that go along with trying to incorporate all of these elements of and genres of thinking into the film the film obviously wouldn't be this way if we weren't able to have that process work. But just want to give like a hats off to those who ushered the film and protected it and fought for it with lawyers, because what you're seeing is like a pretty abnormal collaboration.
It's really beautiful. I was just blown away because there's so many like ingenious and visionary cinematic like elements in the film. Like you've just brought that up. I think one of the most striking choices for me was how the film was shot in first person. And so I wanted to get a sense of, why did you decide to, narrative and cinematically tell the story this way? Whose perspective is really like being depicted through the camera lens, and like what deeper significance does that have? Can you just talk a little bit about why it was important to tell the film from the perspective of these two young Black men?
Yeah, I think, for lack of a better way to say it, I think about things like, 99% of all images by people of color from around the world have been made by not people of color, and I don't even I don't fetishize race. I'm born into a raced world, and I'm forced to contend with the way that the world sees me in order to be a person that's productive and be safe. And so, like, what does that mean that my community has not been able to represent themselves? It doesn't. I mean, I look at archives. It doesn't look to me like the way in which people are shown is the way in which they'd like to be shown. Each archive has its own teleology. They all have their own purpose. The power dynamics historically have not been balanced. And so to me, to make a film from POV is to bring the camera into the body and to like have someone be as close as possible to see me the way that I see myself and the way that I see the world. And then you can put it in contrast to those archival images and like, look at the way that these boys look, in the hands of myself and Jomo, and look at the way that all those other photos look in the hands of other people, like, what does that mean in terms of what we understand Blackness to be and how we understand Black people to be capable of being X, Y, and Z. And so as much as it is an intellectual exercise, it's also a practical one in terms of showing contrast. But it's also, to me, a way to sort of honor as best as possible conceptually the Dozier School boys, right? Because the one thing that they weren't given was life, a long life, a fair life. And so it seems to me like we're kind of like giving them life in a way, like we're allowing them, however short there was, to like have a non overly determined version of a life by bringing the camera as close to what it would look like to look in some of the spaces that they were at. And also the POV sort of memorializes, I think, whatever Black perspective is in an interesting way, or like, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks, man.
So let's talk about the practical nature of that. So what was it like working with cinematographer Jomo Frey to execute like this really immersive experience?
Yeah, it was a real delight. I think, the language of the film is visual, like it is written. The images are preconceived. And I was very afraid that, the DP that I worked with would only do what I wanted and not extend the idea.
Oh, wow.
Like they wouldn't, like, I don't want someone to do what I want. I would like someone to like build and grow. And Jomo was that guy. He's a brilliant dude. He was already thinking about images in a sort of horizontal way as I would. So we melded minds, and then, the idea was able to take a new form, and be developed. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so practically it was like shooting with a Sony Venice on Rialto mode, so it could break down into essentially a DSLR. And then we had maybe 3 or 4 different setups, everything from the actors wearing the camera themselves, which wasn't most of the time, though sometimes in that case they would be a camera operator essentially. We also, most of the time we had the camera tethered, where Jomo or myself, I operated as well, or Sam Ellison would be like around the corner. And like, for example, for the cane poking scene, we have Ethan like really close to a wall like this, and then a camera hanging here. And then like I'm around the corner, like moving it. And that's how we could, remotely do that. But I don't exactly remember your question.
You were answering the practical nature of making this happen. You mentioned the actors and like how sometimes the actors they're wearing the camera. How do you get them used to that process? How are you, directing them to the emotion of the experience? Because you got it. Just want to get you to talk more about that.
Well, I think I feel very fortunate to have worked with actors who came essentially willing to do anything and not overthinking it. Like neither of the two fellas, Ethan Harisi and Brandon Wilson, came with expectations of how the film should be made, would be made, and or were sort of afraid of experimenting, for lack of a better word. And so I didn't prep them really at all. In the script, it says that this is a POV shot. But to me, if I overburdened them with the concepts of the film or how the production would go, then they're not thinking about, embodying the actors or being themselves in the characters. Mm-hmm. And so when it came down to shooting, it's actually not so different. It's just that, obviously it's different, but it's not like a revolutionary difference. I feel like it is in a conceptual sense, but not in a practical sense. It's just that the camera is where the other actor would be. And so it was having them have a specific point on the lens where they needed to look to make sure the eye contact seemed straight. And then over the course of learning what worked for them and what didn't work for them, figuring out ways to have the other actor close, to have them be able to like touch and be in proximity and feel like they're acting with someone, which became really interesting because then Jomo and Sam, who did most of the camera operation with the other actors, then they became the character. Mm-hmm. And they're actually moving and responding to the other, which was really fascinating to see the sort of new ecosystem of relationships that emerged.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what is so beautiful about your work. I was talking about that fluidity earlier because it feels like a dance in places. You can, the camera almost feels like it's dancing. Can you speak a little bit more? I know you just touched on this about the emotionality of your visual style and how you're able to draw out so much emotion even in this unconventional cinematic technique. Yeah,
it's interesting because it's, aesthetics and what they induce or produce, it's ineffable. It's also ephemeral, and so it's hard to articulate like what is the element that hits the emotional button or is sentimental or whatever one wants to call it. I think for this film, the richness of the like and the depth of the photography. But I honestly, I just want to give credit to the actors. I feel like it's like them, all of the crafts folks from Jomo as a DP to Nora Mendez as production designer. Everyone's like doing their technical thing. And then the actors are the ones that make everything coalesce and become elevated to something that like, I can't take any credit for what Anjanou did. Like that is all Anjanou. I maybe help bring things in a slight different direction, but that's like not that's directing because I have the title, but it's not directing in any I don't know. I'm not Scorsese, I don't.
You're RaMell.
I'm RaMell, yeah.
I'm glad.
Wait, I'll say
okay.
That I think a lot has to do with the emotionality of this one is the direct eye contact, because there's something about the way in which characters look at each other that these actors accomplished. I think they translated into the lens, through the lens, into the audience as the character. Mm-hmm. And normally in cinema, we're watching two characters go back and forth. And even when we're, doing an over the shoulder thing, the eye contact is still slightly off lens. Mm-hmm. And so we're always constantly observers. We're never participants, and we're never complicit in the way in which you are fundamentally here. And I think that you're forced to see Elwood, because you are Elwood, the way that Turner sees him. Mm-hmm. You're forced to see Turner the way that Turner sees him. You're forced to get the love that Hattie would give on set to the actors, because Hattie gives it to you because you're the character through the lens. Mm-hmm. And I think that accounts for a lot of the emotion of this.
Okay, let's get a little more granular since you brought that up. I think one of the most emotionally devastating scenes, and there are many, for me was when Hattie, who's obviously played by Anjanou Ellis-Taylor, was discussing the devastation of what happened to her father and her fears for Elwood. It was just beautifully acted and captured. And I wanted to see, can you discuss your process of working through that scene with her and your choices?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the power of this film is built into the way that it was written and the moments that we chose to highlight, because you look at the beating scene and, by not showing it, and having sound design as the primary sensory relationship to it, and having Jomo and I call them throne gazes, where like emotional, hypersensitive moments. While that direction's happening and all those things and editing's happening, it's also so peripheral to something that's horrible that your imagination is doing the work. And so there's something about, I don't know, I haven't seen a scene, which is why Jocelyn and I wrote this one in there. We hadn't seen a scene in which someone who was going through, for the umpteenth time, the being on the tail end of a system that treated them unfairly, we hadn't seen how they coped with it. And obviously in cinema, people have been shown coping with things in various different ways, but coping with it while being composed and being strong, articulating it out into the world. To us, like that moment in itself is emotional, because you're noticing the way that someone has to be strong. And I don't know, like it's I just give all the credit to Anjanou. That's what I do.
It was beautiful, but there's also like the moments of the cake and the knife, and there's the tension, and there's grief, and there's a sadness, and there's a beauty, and it was just wow.
Yeah.
I think another moment that struck me was the time lapse of Turner in the boxcar. It's really stunning. Can you speak to what your inspiration was and how you accomplished that?
Man, I love you asking this question, because we lost I got COVID the first day. Wow. And then our production designer got it the second. And so we got shut down and we lost the week. And so we had to cut the boxcar from the shoot. Mm-hmm. And so I basically, because I have like an art practice and an art studio, I had my art studio manager, who's like a genius builder, build the boxcar at our art studio. And then him and I drove cross country, and that's me in the boxcar. I filmed myself. Wow. Yeah. So we drove like 3 or 4 days. And
so this is a callback to Hale County.
Well, this is a callback to an art piece, performance piece that I did that is pending acquisition by the Brooklyn Museum. It's called Return to Origin, where I shipped myself from Rhode Island to Alabama in a crate. And it was like a 59-hour journey. It was on a gooseneck trailer. Was pretty crazy. The guy didn't know I was in there. I started this project called the Black Dictionary, where I started to write the word Black before every word in a childhood dictionary. So there's like text all over it. And of course I filmed it, but that was the visual inspiration for Turner traveling in the script, because it's like, wow. I'd never seen a time lapse outside of a boxcar, and thinking about the Great Migration, thinking about what the railroad has been for US in terms of travel. It seemed like something we had to do.
I get chills hearing you talk about it. They're giving me the 5-minute warning, and I only have 800 more questions.
You do actually have 800.
I do have. You can see this on my phone. So let's ask a question that may have a shorter answer. There's an alligator throughout the film.
There are two.
Is it 2 alligators? What's the significance?
So one rule of the film, like Hale County, is there's no sort of single-use images. All of the images are, I call them adjacent images. They're one step removed from direct narrative thrust. They always have some sort of multiplicity about them, like multiple things are going on. So the alligators have kind of 3 purposes. One is that it's Florida, and like it does happen, you do come across it. So you're not allowed to think necessarily that it's only surreal or that it's in his head, because it's practical. The second is over the course of American history in the South, specifically, Black children were used as alligator bait.
Yeah.
And so, in order to, get the skin and get the meat, they would steal Black children and put them on the side of a swamp. Alligator would come out. And sometimes they'd wait until they were in the alligator's mouth. Sometimes they wouldn't. And that's how they captured alligators for a while. So wanted to, reproduce a little bit of that history that is a bit lost. And the third, which is the most obvious as kind of like a metaphor for systematic violence and its sort of almost blind reptilian ability to, dismantle the human.
I think I can sneak one last question in. And since you mentioned violence, what led you to the decision to have the violence imagined rather than seen?
Yeah. Well, I would say I'd make a slight edit to your question, which I think is a great question. It's not imagined, but to have it just not seen or not visualized because it's still there.
You can feel the tension of it.
Yeah.
You definitely can.
And in fact, it is happening, and it happens in the mind of every single person watching. And I'm unsure if that's more terrifying, but I do know that we've probably over-indexed on images of Black people being subjects of violence. All we need to do is see, if we see like a white person outside laying in the middle of the street, we're like, we think one thing. If we see a Black person, it draws on, Mike Brown. It draws on a different history. And, because in that sense that Black skin is content, and your relationship to the Black community is more a Rorschach test to your relationship to it than it is anything that's actually true. It seemed like it was more interesting to not show it. But also, if you think about what it's like, if you want to take to its conceptual extreme, having the camera as an organ in your body, like for people that are in those situations, and this just comes from myself having body injuries in sports and stuff, like once you see the broken ankle or you look away and you concentrate on some detail to get you through whatever stage, the ambulance is coming, you're like watching the people run and you're like keen into their feet as they get closer. Cinema has always used the vision of it as a way to get to how painful it was. But for people in it, they're not looking at that. And so we want to take that literally.
RaMell, thank you for this film. Wonderful. I appreciate your work and thank you for all that you do.
No, Channing, thank you for your wonderful questions. Yeah. Thanks for staying.
Thanks for listening to another DGA Q&A. The Director's Cut is available wherever you listen to podcasts. And please share, subscribe, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your feedback, and you can help fellow film buffs find the show. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. This podcast is produced by the Directors Guild of America